Good morning, everybody. Welcome again to one of our open book tours. Our guide this morning will be Anne Greenwood. Anne comes from the high plains of the Dakotas. The tribe from which she came were butchers, artists, and naturalists. And she has fulfilled that sort of familial destiny by being very comfortable as an artist in nature and enjoying a good steak. And I think the quality of Anne's that I appreciate the most, apart from the specific art that she does, is her sense of community. She is very close to her community in Portland, both as an artist and as a, what is the?
Maybe facilitator of the arts,
a
or
consultant in horticulture.
horticulture.
We
Okay.
got it.
Yeah, got it.
Okay, in horticulture. And it was because of Anne's, the close ties she would create with her community that we have this beautiful display of Icelandic book artists, and spent almost a year in Iceland a year ago, isn't it? Close?
Close.
And became very close to the art community, and found out about this wonderful collection of work by Icelandic women artists that was going on tour, and told us about it. So we have been able to enjoy it here. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you Anne Greenwood.
Thank you, Cynthia. I really appreciate your contribution to the book arts. This museum is incredible, and I've enjoyed coming up here a couple of different times. I was up here last spring talking about, kind of introducing the community to my work, and as I did return from Iceland in June, with this connection to the Icelandic book artists, Cynthia and Amy asked me to come again and present their work and talk a little bit about my experience. So I'm going to start first with something that I created, and then talk a little bit about my experience in Iceland and the women that I met there. Most recently, so I returned from Iceland in June. I did a residency at the Textile Center, the Icelandic Textile Center there. And while I was in residence, I brought a bunch of things that I had been working on and trying to finish, and then also was very inspired by the place and the people. And while in residence, started all these different projects that I really didn't know where they were going to go or what the inspiration was coming from. But when I returned to Portland, an old friend of mine whose daughter had returned to Portland from being in college was running a little community gallery. And so she said, I really would love you to show and share your experience in Iceland. And so that really made me start to tie things together. You know, I felt like, okay, if I'm having an exhibit, I need to finish a book, I need to really look at this stuff. And so in my journal, while I had been in Iceland, I was working in a large community, shared community studio. I was working with two fashion designers from London and another tapestry artist from Denmark, and working in a community studio like that, and having traveled that far to make art, I didn't know what equipment to bring with me. And so while I was there, I really kind of started using what was in the studio. And there were these kind of unique tools that I had never seen. Maybe if I were a tailor or something like that, I would have. But there were these little tabletop ironing boards that were stuffed really full, I think for creating fashion designs or something like that. So one of the things that I did when I first set up my studio was I brought out a bunch of textiles and started ironing. I think just as kind of a way to ground myself, it's a task, a domestic task. And when I was ironing, some of the fabric started creasing, and I started just kind of exploring that and going into creasing fabric and pleating fabric and wrinkling fabric and working in my journal kind of side by side and thinking about, growing up on the high plains with my father, who was a field biologist, and he was always carrying around field guides with him, learning about the birds and the animals. And so one of the first things I started doing in my journal was creating kind of a field guide format. I created these pen and ink sort of places to record information. And as I was creasing fabric, I was kind of creasing a big sheet of fabric and then cutting it up into little pieces and thinking, oh, this looks kind of like a landscape. This looks like this, or this looks like that. And so, the experimentation of creasing different colors of fabric and looking out into the landscape and thinking about my connections to people and place, I created this field guide, what I call a field guide. It's called Vestiges. I made 2 different editions. One is a regular edition, and I'll show you this one, which is the deluxe edition, which has a map inside. The edition size is 40 with 10 deluxe editions. And one of the unique things for me about this project was I started to collaborate with my husband, Mauricio, who's in the room. He joined me in Iceland for the last 2 weeks, and so it was great for me to have somebody to kind of talk about what we saw and what we experienced, because Iceland is such a incredibly unique place that I needed to sort of process that with somebody else. And so we came up with the name kind of together, just brainstorming, looking at the book and talking about what we experienced, and came up with the title Vestiges. And this is a material that I work with a lot called buckram or crinoline. And this is letterpress printed. I worked with a colleague of mine, Diane Jacobs, who has Scranton Press in Portland. And this is kind of a poem or a description written by my husband, Mauricio. I'll read it to you. Vestiges, slight indications of something intangible, perceptible marks of what is past or no longer existent, existing biological forms of something that once was more fully developed, scars. We follow indelible tinctures as familiar traces in seeking our paths. Every moment, actions transforming into vestiges of our former selves, to be discovered by others. Tincture with qualities that color, pervade, or distinguish the world for us, an artifice with which immaterial things are disfigured or transformed. So the first image is, you can see this creased fabric. It's the buckram that's been dyed and printed on. And then I'm using walnut ink and brushing lettering here. So there are 7 individual kind of folios of these different kind of landscape-inspired images that are just creased. I'm just using the iron to set the image. And then the writing is, it is authored by me, and it is, when I was making this, I was just really, instinctual and intuitive, and thinking about the image and then writing something, and then moving on to another image and then writing something. And so these were really first impressions of what I was making and what I was seeing. And they do, a lot of them reference, the geology, the shared geology of Oregon and Iceland, the basalt and the volcanic activity of the place. And this work is also inspired by a previous project that I did. I often use, sometimes my projects will overlap, so I'll make something, as an installation, and then take it down, take it apart, and use the fabric from that for something else. And in this case, my previous project was dyeing and pressure printing on this fabric, and then I continued to use it in this project.
Did you say how long you were in Iceland?
I was there for 2 months, last spring, at a place called the Icelandic Textile Center, which is it's an old women's college in the north of Iceland. 8 residents spend from 1 to 3 months there, working on research or textiles specific projects. So this is my latest book. As you can see, it's in progress, given the blank images. So in the deluxe edition, at the gallery, I hosted a community engagement activity where I asked participants to, gather a memento from a place that they had been, because I think a lot of us bring rocks or sticks or, items from nature, shells. They all kind of travel around with us. So I have a great big jar of, mementums from places or objects, random objects that I've collected. So I asked participants to bring something like that to the workshop, and we took those objects, and I don't know if you're familiar with shibori, which is a Japanese dyeing technique. And so we were taking pieces of crinoline or buckram and placing an object inside, or folding the fabric and placing an object inside, and then bundling it up with rubber bands or string or tying to make a pattern. And so we had a lot of participation, and these maps came out of that experience. So each one of the deluxe editions has this kind of fold-out map inside that was dyed by somebody, one of the participants in the workshop. And then I have written some poetry and writing in this book, and this continues that. So this was a big part of the installation that I did in Portland this fall, called Tinctures. And also included in that exhibit were, it was a small interior space that I painted some mural work on the walls that was abstract, relating to some of the color palette, and then some bigger creased work that I did that reflected, again, landforms and natural shapes. One of the other things I put in the exhibit was this series of small embroideries that I've been dragging around with me for years, not knowing why I'm doing it or what I'm doing. And I brought them to Iceland with me. I had pre-cut all these shapes from an old wool blanket, and some of them were finished, others were not. And while I was in Iceland, it was another one of my tasks that I just had spread out on these big tables, and I would sit down and embroider. And, we did quite a few field trips at the residence where, we went out into the landscape or bused to different neighboring towns and, seeing the environment and looking at the place. And there was also a pretty extensive library at the residency. And so I was learning about Icelandic runes and some of the traditional magic of the place and the folklore. And some of this imagery that I was creating before I went to Iceland was started to look like that. And then meeting some of the Icelandic artists and seeing some of their work, it was, kind of starting to make sense to me. And so when I returned to Portland, I had all of these 44 little ovals laid out on a desk, and a friend of mine was visiting my studio, and I said, I don't know what this is. Can you give me some clues, And she said, well, I think you're making an oracle deck that's inspired by the runes and, traditional Nordic heritage. And so what I've been working on, this is a little bit of in-progress work. These were all hung in the installation, with monofilament from the ceiling, mixed in with the mural work and other work on the walls. And so I've started to kind of mock up a new project here. And this is the crinoline again. And, I've been looking at some different artists who make decks of cards. I've been talking with Mare Blocker, who's local. She's made quite a few decks of cards. And so, I'm starting to try to figure out what sort of form this is going to take. If I'm going to use offset printing, or if I'm going to do screen printing or letterpress, or, I want to include a small booklet along with the cards that kind of explains each one and talks about how to use the deck and where the inspiration is from. So this is just a little bit of in-progress work. There are 44 of these, and I'm just now kind of reading more books on the Icelandic runes and mythology, and trying to piece this together as a larger project. So that was one thing that was in the installation. I also, before I went on the residency, like Cynthia said, I do a lot of community projects, and one of my more recent projects has been, I'm collaborating with a new person, Justice Tyrone Gooden, from Portland, and he has started this small, he calls it a company. I don't know if it's a company or if it's a project, but it's called Big Eyes Tiny Movies. And we've just recently received a Regional Arts and Culture Council grant to bring this project into a local school. And he's a videographer and filmmaker, and so his idea is to teach children how to use their cell phones to make movies so that they're not just on social media and they're not just texting with their friends. So he challenged me while I was in Iceland to make a movie on my iPhone or my iPad. And so I have not done any of that kind of work previously. And one of the things that inspired me in Iceland was a lot of artists there and a lot of the previous residents had been bringing their artwork out into nature and filming it or photographing it in relationship to the place. And I was working in the dye studio quite a bit and, like re-dyeing all of these and working on these other objects that I've been carrying around with me forever. Some of the stitching work I do sometimes I feel like is just meditative. It's just a task that I do, like reading or something like that. And so I dyed all this silk fabric that had been repurposed clothing, silk clothing, and I was dyeing these and sewing them together and then hanging them out on the clothesline and then videotaping the wind kind of taking these. And I, as an artist, my daughters have taught me to participate in social media. I'm on Instagram. That's how I stay connected to them sometimes. So I was posting a lot of this, what I was doing in Iceland on Instagram, and got a lot of comments on these. People were really, curious. What is this piece of fabric blowing around in nature? And so this became my project for my friend Justice. Was my family came to meet me in Iceland, and I took these with me, and we traveled around and hung them up in different places, and I started recording the fabric blowing in the wind because I really wanted to try to capture somehow the place. The elements are such a big part of Iceland, and there's really no way to photograph wind, so this became one of my challenges. And then I gathered other clips of video kind of along the way and created a short video for him, which in this installation I projected onto hanging fabric in the gallery, which was a very new direction for me, but it was very creative and very inspiring for a lot of people and myself. So this is something, again, that's in progress. One of the other inspiring artists that came to the residency while I was there is an artist named Celia Pium from London. And her primary medium is mending. So she will set up, a community engagement activity in a public place and ask people to bring things that need to be mended. And so then they will sit and they will mend and talk about, the clothes that they're mending and where they came from and why they're mending them. And then in her personal work, she takes items of clothing that are completely, moth-eaten and almost irreparable, and she will mend the entire thing. So the object becomes more about the mending than the original piece of clothing that it was. And the project she worked on while she had been in residence in Iceland a couple of years ago was this historic cape that she was commissioned by a theater company to repair, and in her own creative artistic way. So she was returning to Iceland with this cape to bring it to this local school and have students put this cape on, and then she would photograph them and video record them moving around in this antiquity cape, you know, that had been mended and mended and mended, and then, you know, she'd have the children try it on and she'd bring it back to the studio and she'd have to do all this repair work. And so that's what was happening to my work too. I was bringing it out into nature, and you know, spots were opening up, and it kind of gave me a context for, you know, working with an old kind of tattered piece of fabric and giving it some kind of new life. So that was a big part of this new work that I was doing this fall at the Outer Space Gallery in Portland. And so while I was in Iceland, one of the reasons I met up with this group of artists there was, you know, I was awarded the residency, I think in 2017. And then I started exploring grant opportunities to fund the residency and my travel, and kind of frame it as a deeper career development for myself. So I started reaching out to different artists in Iceland, and one of the best responses I received was from this group called the Akir Book Arts Group in Iceland. And we started corresponding over email, and I asked, you know, if we could meet up when I got to Iceland and if they knew about the residency, and they became kind of a point of contact for me there. And I did end up receiving a grant from the Oregon's Arts Commission to go to Iceland and pursue, you know, a collaboration with this group of book artists and meet with them and present my work. And so that was a real highlight of the trip for me. I got to Iceland, went to the residency, and then we negotiated a couple of different times to meet while I was there. And they were mostly based in Reykjavik. And so I traveled down from the north to meet with them and did several studio visits. The main corresponder of the group, Aslag, is a professional children's book illustrator. And I think there are 11 members in the group. I ended up meeting with probably 5 of the members while I was there. And their group is 11 Icelandic book artists who have been working together since 1998. They had their first solo exhibit in 2005. And at the time that I met with them, they had a big group exhibit in Portland, Maine that was just coming down. And so I didn't get to see a lot of their work because it was in that exhibit. But I did see how multifaceted all of these artists are. You know, like I said, Aslag is a professional children's book illustrator. One of the other women I met with was Svanborg. These names are a little difficult for me. Svanborg, who was a painter, her primary medium in her studio was, she did these huge paintings of, you know, the one that I remember the most was this sort of unicorn horse-like figure, the animal that was passing through the landscape. The painting was very light colored, but you could kind of feel the presence of this animal emerging from it, partially because it was so large. It was probably the size of that wall back there. But her being a painter, most of her books are one of a kind, and they are all painting. You can see one up in the top corner there. So as a group, they meet, and I wasn't able to gather fully their process of working together, but it seems like part of what they do is come up with techniques that they want to learn, and then they work as a group to kind of familiarize themselves with those techniques and oftentimes make a series of books out of them, each one being kind of different. But, Svanborg's work being primarily one of a kind, she wasn't doing many of the techniques that some of the artists were. She was engaged in doing some of the repurposing of old books, which you can see in some of the work here too. One of the other artists I met was Helga Paulina, and she was a professor at one of the local art colleges, and I toured her house and studio, and she was doing everything. Printing on fabric and carving in wood and dyeing wood and collecting rocks from the landscape and knitting kind of appendages that she was tying to the rocks. And, it was so creative. All of their work, all of their imagery and their techniques were, something I see in book arts in the United States. But there, it just really took on a completely different feeling for me. I think just seeing such a concentration of this unfamiliar uniqueness. So I spent a couple of times meeting with these women. I met with Aslag, with Helga, with Svigborg, with Svanborg, and with Osap, and touring their studios. Helga and Svanborg took me out to galleries, and we looked at public art all over the city. And we started talking about a potential future collaboration together. And since I was at the Icelandic Textile Center, which was in this agricultural region of Iceland, there were all these, like I said, we did some field trips and visited different places. One of the places we visited was the only wool washery in all of Iceland. All the wool from all the sheep comes to this location, and it's kind of like harvest in the Midwest in the fall or something. There are these two sheep shearings per year, one in the spring, one in the fall. And, the wool washery, when I was there, was processing the spring harvest. And so there was, bales and bales of wool everywhere, in trucks, dirty wool, clean wool. And, we spent a couple of different afternoons at the wool washery, seeing this whole process, and they were allowing us access to this raw wool that we could take home and experiment with us. There was also a fish skin tannery there, where they are, it was full of all sorts of different hides, but the primary textile that they try to produce is this tanned salmon skin, which is a beautiful material. you know, a lot of what they were experimenting with is dyeing it and making it into bow ties or neckties or purses or boots or shoes. So we also had access to some of those materials. And then one of the other assets in the community is a very beautiful textiles museum, which is not connected to the residency, but it's, you know, it's walking distance from the residency. So we spent quite a bit of time there. Most things in Iceland are only open June through August because that's the tourist season, and that's when the weather is more predictable. So the Textiles Museum, they open for the residents to come in and do a tour and then spend as much time studying objects as they want. But it was a real asset to the residency to have this beautiful museum there. And that's when I met the first member of the group, Helga. She came up to tour the museum and do a special project with one of the research groups at the museum. And so we started talking about a collaboration at that time. And I also just started learning quite a bit about Icelandic textiles that I hadn't known in the past. One of the primary things that was interesting to me was that, you know, when Iceland was being settled as a place, wool and cloth were currency. You know, there was no other real resources that were being traded or exchanged for other products. So the museum, Textile Museum, houses some of the very first fabrics that were woven in Iceland. And the worth of the fabric was based on its thread count. So in order to get a very fine thread count, that meant that you were processing wool in a very careful way. You were, you know, carding and spinning in a very skilled level. And so she, the woman who curates and operates the Textiles Museum, was making sure that we were all aware of the intricacies of weaving and how important it was for the Icelandic culture. And one room at the museum is houses all the work of a specific woman who collected this very fine weaving. And her name is Halladóra, and she was a domestic consultant for the National Farmers Union in Iceland for many years. And so she kind of helped set the standard for this very fine weaving. And one of the other projects that is underway at the Textiles Residency is preserving all of the patterns that are unique to Iceland. So there are countless swatch books that have little tiny scraps of weaving in them, and all of those are being documented and preserved and recorded, along with the unique knitting patterns. So the Lopa Pesa sweater is very, is traditional of Iceland, and that's kind of chunky wool knit with the yoke of different patterns. And so, another thing I learned about Icelanders is that they are very good at recording their history and very careful about documenting and tracking the history and the resources and all these traditional crafts from the past. So as I started talking more with Helga and meeting with the group in Reykjavik, one of the ideas that came up for us to entertain a collaboration around was Helga and Svanborg had been at the museum a year or so past, and they had done an extensive kind of documenting of a lot of the objects that were packed away and on display. And so one of the ideas we're considering is, creating like a Dropbox file online with all of these images, and then several of the past residents from the Textile Center and the Book Arts Group will sort through these items and decide on one or decide on a theme or pull something from that collection and make a series of work about the work in the museum.
Excuse me,
Uh-huh.
but do any of the books reflect any of the intricate weaves or patterns or?
I haven't seen a lot of that. That's one of the things that I'm interested in exploring in a new work. But most of their work is, they sent me some descriptions. This exhibit is called Borderland, and it's about, the earth and the land and the environment. And, I didn't see a lot of, this is the first time I've seen this exhibit, and so I didn't notice anything that really reflected what I saw in the museum. But some of the work that we did talk about, and that I do have a little bit of description on, is this is Aslag's piece called Earth. And she's written, "This book is a collection of round-shaped images, each one like an orb of its own. Half open, the book forms a hemisphere. Closed, the form is a quarter of a circle. The photographs show various surfaces of the land, of the ground, the earth, the seasons, and the soil, the dirt under our feet, all of what deserves to be valued and cherished and given time to observe. We tend instinctively to seek the green, fertile, and flourishing nature, but the peripheral areas of the earth, the land where the wind, the rain, the frost, the snow, flood, and drought make it just about habitable, are no less fascinating as they are so often reveal the amazing victory of life. The word earth has many meanings that are closely linked indeed to a small word with huge significance." So, in Iceland there are all these amazing colors that you just see kind of in mass when you're driving around, given the different seasons of the year.
Pass that around.
Okay. One of the other books, given the theme is Borderland, I didn't meet this woman, Christina, but this is called Family Field. This book is a family record. It is a list of my parents' descended who from 2012, when the book was created, numbered a total of 72 people. If repeated today, the book would include almost 100 names. When the book is open, the tabs or flags containing the individuals' names pop up and clash against each other as if to communicate and sway back and forth when the book is dragged open like an accordion. Further play with the book's form results in the interweaving of the tabs into a nest-like shape. We are all one of a kind, like the name tags, while still processing common connections and roots. This is work by the painter that I told you about. Svanborg created this, I think it's a one-of-a-kind again, called Mountains. And she says, land, landscape, mountains, distances, an interaction of oval, horizontal, and diagonal lines form compositions and fantasy. From the oval shape of the pages stem the play of lines, forms, and compositions which portray these fantasy landscapes. The properties of the materials used, the type of paper and paint, were a controlling factor in the development of the visual outcome.
Are we allowed to photograph any of these? We are, okay.
And the woman that I mentioned, Helga, who, works in so many different mediums, this is one of her books. So, some of what she showed me was a series of silk scarves that she had been making with digital printing, which this is what that looks like. So in this book, she says, it's called Runes by Helga Paulina. I won't pronounce the last name. Ruins of old turf farmhouses are found throughout Iceland, and many of them have been documented in drawings. These forms appear in the landscape, weather-worn and half-destroyed, as a symbol of past habitation or as an alphabetical form. Yeah, so I think this was the mock-up for the one that was laser cut, and yeah. And then this is a beautiful series too. This is called New Immigrants by a woman that I didn't meet, Johanna. And these I'm pretty sure are one of a kind. And it's called New Immigrants. I have been investigating several new immigrants who have settled in Iceland over the past decades. These settlers respect no borders, and we have no choice other than to accept their way of life. Studies have shown that the conditions necessary for these small animals to settle in Iceland have been created gradually through global warming, international travel, increased imports of goods. I want you to see that what's inside of these are, unique, different immigrants to the place. Some insects, some birds. So 3 of these new settlers elicit in us dread and fear of the unknown. These are the biting midges, no-see-ums, the castor bean ticks, and the Spanish slug. I have studied all of these creatures with curiosity and an open mind, making an effort to see the beauty of their features and details instead of looking at the damage they do. Finally, there is the goldcrest, the smallest bird in Europe, which is such a welcome addition to our bird life and which helps in the fight against the green spruce aphids on the Sitka spruce. This little bird makes me hope that nature itself strives to achieve a natural balance. What we need to do is to give nature more attention and more respect. And so these are, each book is unique, and I think she's using free motion, machine embroidery, watercolor, and drawing. And here's one of the last books. This is called Cities by Sigborg. And this is a recycled book in which she is cutting out from existing pages and adding pages. This book takes on the subject of man-made landscapes, cities, and many of the problems associated with them. Pollution, overcrowding, isolation, and how desperate human effort to stop this trend have continued throughout the world. To create this book, I have used mixed techniques. Only one example has produced thus far. Yeah, so it's a one of a kind. Yeah, so these are all really exciting new experiments in book arts for me. I haven't seen a lot of these techniques before. And a group of these women will be coming to the Codex Book Fair in San Francisco in February. And if you're not familiar with what Codex is, it's a biannual book arts conference in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. And there are lectures and there's an opportunity to meet the book artists and see their work and buy their work, and also all sorts of book arts supply houses and materials vendors are there too. And this year, the Acure group will be joined with a new group, which is called, I think it's Codex Nordic. And so many of the Nordic countries have joined together in a book arts group, and they are presenting lectures and their work at a table at Codex this upcoming year.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been fascinating.